doing this.
Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Victoria Williams. I'm a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is my pleasure to welcome Michael Beschloss to the council this evening. His new book, Presidents of War, will be available for sale and signing after the program from our partners, the bookseller. This is a members-only program, and as such, we'd like to thank you all, to our members here in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. For those tuning in online with a membership at the council, you could also be in the room for these type of events. Before we begin, please note today's event is on the record and is being live streamed. We always welcome your social media engagement, but please silence your cell phones. Note that the council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the council. Later, we'll be taking audience questions from in the room and from online. You may submit your questions online by opening up your browser at chi.cnf.io. Now, by way of brief introduction, our guest today is Michael Beschloss. He is the NBC News presidential historian and PBS NewsHour contributor. Born and raised in Chicago, Michael Beschloss received an Emmy and 6 honorary degrees and is the author of 9 books on presidential history. Most recently, the New York Times bestseller, Presidential Courage and the Conquerors, as well as 2 volumes on President Lyndon Johnson's secret tapes. And moderating this discussion is Cécile Shea. Cécile is a non-resident senior fellow on global security and diplomacy at the council. Served as a U.S. diplomat for over 2 decades and has served as a senior political policy advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Pakistan, a vice consul in Thailand. Previously, Cécile was a foreign policy fellow in the office of former Senator Joe Lieberman and was a national security affairs fellow at the Hoover Institute. Now, please join me in welcoming Michael Beschloss and Cécile Shea.
Thank you. I was so excited when I received the invitation to be here tonight because I have been a fan of Michael Beschloss for decades, both of his outstanding books and his writing, and also of his commentary and his analysis of current events that we've been so fortunate to watch on TV for all of these years.
So now I have nowhere to go but down with you.
No, I don't think so.
I should probably be quiet and just walk right out.
I want to tell you all I was fortunate to receive an advanced copy of this book, and it is so great. It's hard to write a page turner when you're writing a history, and this is a page turner that also gave to me enormous insights into where we are as a country and where we may need to adjust course if we are going to make it for another 200 years. So thank you for writing this, and I really recommend it to all of you. I think it's just a fabulous, fabulous book. We're going to begin with 2 quick trivia questions to see how educated our members-only audience is tonight. Question number 1, under the U.S. Constitution, which branch of government has the sole authority to declare war? Oh, look, Illinois Public Schools.
Excellent.
Great, yeah, very good. Question number 2, who was the last president to go to war with a declaration of war? Wow, that's pretty good.
I don't think an average cross-section of Americans, unfortunately, would give that answer. I wish it were true.
So with that setup, let's open with what is the theme of this book, the primary theme of the book that you
Well,
read?
the main one is the founders had this idea in 1787 that they were very worried that in creating this new job of President of the United States that we might be in danger that presidents would become like the kings of Europe or dictators. And Madison particularly tried to make sure that that didn't happen in the way that kings most often became dictators, which was in war. If the king was getting unpopular, one way he would fix things would be to fabricate an incident, generate a war, and suddenly everyone was united and loving the king again. It was a great temptation to get involved in frequent wars that weren't necessary, so they wanted to do the same thing in the United States. And so therefore, with huge aforethought, just as our brilliant audience has affirmed, they gave the war power to Congress. They kept it completely out of the hands of the president. And the idea was that this would do a lot to keep us out of wars that were not necessary, not necessarily supported by an overwhelming number of people among the American public, and also wars that might not be overwhelmingly and intensely supported by Congress. And so the problem was that Madison, from my point of view, was a terrific founder, was an awful president. 1 out of 2 is not bad. I mean, he was a really good founder.
Yeah.
But what happened was, in 1812, there was a great movement to go to war with England by a group called the War Hawks. And Madison was tempted by going to war by their arguments. He said, well, the British are harassing our ships, and wouldn't it be nice to grab Canada? Didn't quite put it in that language, but that's what he was after.
Yeah.
And so, despite the fact that he was the one who tried to write a constitution making it very hard for this nation to go to war, our first major war was basically started by James Madison, who broke his own system by saying to Congress, I think this war is necessary. And what's worse is that Madison did this for reasons of vanity, which was exactly what the founders were worried about. It's just, it's almost something out of the Bible. It's so mythic that when he went to Congress and got his war, he found that he sort of liked being a war president. He didn't have a big war record like George Washington. This gave him more power in other areas of the presidency. He had a uniform tailored for himself with a gleaming sword that he wore at the side, made him feel a little bit more powerful and more august. He had a bicorn hat with a little feather. You know, he was having fun. And so the point I'm making is that our first test of this constitutional system, James Madison, of all people, is the president, and he completely flunks by getting us into a war that was deeply unpopular. It was for purposes, grabbing Canada, I don't think is a matter of our immediate national security. Would have been nice to keep the British from harassing our ships, but am I allowed to ask a trivia question too?
Yeah, please.
All right, here's my question for all of you. It's a little harder, but I think you'll get it. What was the most unpopular war in American history? It was not Vietnam, 1812. What was the first time we lost a war? 1812. Despite what was often said, including by Lyndon Johnson, I'm not going to be the first president to lose a war, meaning Vietnam. Well, bad news is he lost the war, he had Nixon. The good news is that they weren't the first.
So when we sing the Star-Spangled Banner,
I say sing the Star-Spangled Banner all the time, and I practice what I preach. On the front of this book is the Star-Spangled Banner with the rocket's red glare and the Battle of Fort McHenry. It was a great victory for the United States, but as I write in the book, I open the book with a moment that's actually more important, and that is August of 1814. What happened then? We could make this sort of speaker and response from crowd. What happened in August of 1814? Burning of the White House. So the scene I've got is I begin with James Madison fleeing the White House because the British are coming after him, not only to burn the Capitol and the White House, but hopefully hang him and take him back to London as a battle trophy, because he's run the War of 1812 so badly that the British are attacking Washington and even able to burn the residence of the president and in danger of taking the president and assassinating him. So he's running through the forest. He's looking for Dolly, who ran away herself. By the way, she did not take the portrait of George Washington with her, I'm sorry to report. But the way I do,
But she did hide it. You
she asked for it to be removed.
She asked for it to be hidden, okay.
But I deal in truth, not in legend. So anyway, and so the way I put it is, I tell the story and show the scene, and if you see it, as I used to say when I was in the Flossmoor Public Schools in the 3rd grade, read the book and find out. But what happens is that James Madison, because of all the mistakes he made, especially getting us involved in this war that was not necessary, it's almost like a moral fable. He is condemned to being in this dark forest, running for his life. And in an early draft, not a later draft, I said it was almost rough justice for him violating his own system for keeping out of wars, but I really do feel that.
And that comes across in the book. But I think the other point you make in the book is even once Congress has declared war, which they did not in the War of 1812, I guess.
Well, they did, but they did it grudgingly and by a bare margin. And also, as I say, you were asking about StarSpangled Banner, wonderful anthem, although does everyone know what the real words to that are? It's actually a semi-obscene drinking song. The new lyrics are better. And I'm all for Don't Give Up the Ship and Andrew Jackson's heroism at New Orleans, but this is all sort of a scam because it's a way that people tried to make the War of 1812 look like a victory. If you remember Andrew Jackson, if you remember the Star-Spangled Banner and the great songs and the great slogans, old Ironsides, I'm all for it. But the problem is, if you remember a war that was actually a failure, if you remember it as a victory, you were more prone to get involved in another war that maybe you should not wage. Cue James Polk, who was a young man during 1812, and who, while he was president, as I write in the book, had used a cane. And on the cane was carved heroic scenes of the War of 1812, exactly what you don't want in the mind of James K. Polk.
Right. And you make the point. I found that for me, the most compelling part of this book is the Mexican-American War, in part because I really don't feel like I knew that much about it. And it may be the most important war we've ever fought that most Americans don't really know that much about. And in part because you make the point that Congress's job just doesn't end when it votes to go to war. And that was the failure in that war, that Congress didn't keep up with what Polk was doing. So
I mean, just to remind, I know everyone of you is an obsessive student of the Mexican War, so just in case someone sneaked in who's not. What happened was in 1846, James Polk was a liar and a cheat and a bully. He became president. He was desperate to have a war with Mexico. And the reason for that was a noble aim. He wanted this to be a continental nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which would require our getting nearly 1 million square miles of land from Mexico. And the way he thought to do that was to have a war and basically force the Mexicans to give it to us for a cheap price. So the question then arises, how do you get the war? Well, Polk was someone who was completely unscrupulous, so he sent Zachary Taylor's soldiers down to Texas to provoke the Mexicans into attacking us, which they did. And then Polk went back to Congress and said, Mexicans have attacked. We need a huge war against Mexico, and not just along the Rio Grande, by the way. We have to march all the way down to Mexico City, which will take about 2 years, which he did. Two of the biggest anti-war senators were the famous senators Daniel Webster, Massachusetts, and Henry Clay, Kentucky. They deeply opposed this as an illegal war based on a fake incident. It's hugely poignant, and I write their stories in this book. Both of their sons were killed fighting in James Polk's war. And so finally the war was won. We did get the land. And this is a classic case, and you find it so often in history, don't you, of ends versus means, and you've got to weigh them. You know, oftentimes in American history, we've achieved some very noble ends by doing some pretty horrible things. And Mexican War, in my opinion, is an example of that because it made us a continental nation. We would not be the great nation we are without James K. Polk. However, he did this in the most corrupt and lying way that violated the Constitution, was deeply disrespectful to members of Congress and to the American people, in my point of view, and most of all, once again, set another horrible example for later presidents to get wars in ways that were not truthful. For instance, 1898, the sinking of the Maine off Havana, which I tell that story. William McKinley says we've got to go to war against Spain, substantially in revenge for the Spanish attack on our ship. Well, the news is the ship sank, and it sank because there was a boiler accident. The Spanish had nothing to do with it, but we fought a war that made us a world power for the first time. Ends versus means. Skip ahead, Lyndon Johnson, 1964, whom I dearly love for Medicare and civil rights and a lot of other things. On war, he did some terrible things. It began with the Gulf of Tonkin. Everyone remember that? Not necessarily from being alive then, but at least studying it. And that turns out to be, and I did these books on LBJ's tapes, so I've listened to his 674 hours of tapes of his private conversations. And if my language has been good so far, it's because I've tried to avoid sounding like him, saying that people can't find their rear ends with both hands, and he doesn't say rear ends, things like that. But one of the things that you hear on these tapes is that in 1964, he got word that there might have been an attack on an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. So he goes on TV and says, there has been an unprovoked attack against an American ship, and we must bomb North Vietnam, which he did, and got Gulf of Tonkin resolution out of Congress, almost unanimous, saying I must use force. And they did it in good faith. And the tapes show that within a couple of weeks, Johnson found out that there was no attack at all, and he knew it was not unprovoked because we were provoking the North Vietnamese with little boats and so forth who were firing. And so for the next 10 years, we had a war in Vietnam waged by Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, with great force, based on the essential congressional sanction was this flimsy resolution based on an attack that never took place. In terms of the way our system is supposed to work, it's a corruption, and it was illicit. And the worst of all, and I repeat, I love Lyndon Johnson for other things, and leaders are both good and bad, but I think the worst thing he ever did in the course of that war was in February of 1965. And those of you who remember the war, who've studied it, February of 65 was the first month that LBJ was sending big numbers of young Americans to Vietnam to die. They were idealistic. Through 200 years, we've had wonderful heroism on the battlefield by our soldiers, men and women. Unfortunately, one of the themes of this book is that much too often that has not been matched by honest or great leadership from our presidents. And LBJ in February of 1965, in public, he's sending these young kids off to die. You've seen the pictures of him going to the side of the transports, saying goodbye to them as they get on the plane. And so in private, he's talking to Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense. Secret conversation that he taped, so only I think I was near to being the first person to hear it. And he's saying about Vietnam, I can't think of anything worse than losing the war in Vietnam, and I do not see any way that we can win. The very beginning. And I can't think of much worse for a president to do than to send people off to die under false pretenses, to die in a war that he at the very beginning does not feel that we can win. And I cannot explain, you're welcome to clap, because it was a terrible thing. And it was a terrible example for our kids and for our later presidents. And it is very hard for me to explain how someone who could have done something as monstrous as that could have genuinely had the same big heart that led him to do civil rights and aid to education. And one other thing which I actually had a scoop on, which is in early 1968, the war had dragged on for 3 years, and we were losing badly. And William Westmoreland, who was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, is contacting Johnson and says, we may suffer a defeat at Khe Sanh, our installation, and I think we should move nuclear weapons to Vietnam and just fire them off to avoid a defeat at Khe Sanh. And thank God for Lyndon Johnson in this case. He said, are you out of your mind? I don't want any weapons moved to Vietnam, which they would have had to be moved, I think, from Eva would know, probably Guam and or Okinawa, because they sure were not in the field of battle. And Johnson, to his great credit, said, not only do I not want this planning stopped immediately, I want every piece of paper that has been generated, cables, planning documents, I want them all immediately to be put in a safe. and I don't want them to be open for years because I don't, this is my language, but it's pretty close to what Johnson would have said in this case, not on tape. I don't want stupid generals running around and saying that they could have won the Vietnam War, and I squelched this, and they should have been allowed to use nukes. This is much too dangerous. So most of those documents were locked up for decades, and it's one reason why I was able to get some of them the last couple of years and have them new in this book, is because they were just declassified. That's the great Johnson. And for all of us who are watching presidents in modern times, and I'm not political here, Donald Trump, but also would be true of anyone who is serving as president in our time, let's make sure that we have a president that hands-on, because if Lyndon Johnson did not have the brilliance to stop that stupid move toward nuclear weapons, you could have very easily had nuclear weapons being fired in Vietnam, first time in anger since 1945, easily could have engaged the Russians and Chinese. There were Russians in Hanoi, Chinese too. We could have had a nuclear war that could have killed 60 million people just because Westmoreland came up with a stupid idea, and we might not have had a president who was there to make sure it never happened.
You don't talk about Nixon in this book, but
not as much as
not as
the
much
others.
as
I
the
do
others.
at the end.
I read some transcripts from some National Security Council meetings recently, and the generals are talking about bringing in tactical nukes into Western Europe, and he's basically said the same thing, which is, are you people out of your mind?
No, Nixon was experienced, and he was a grown-up, and that's one thing you get if you have a president who does have some government experience or military experience, or knowledge of history. And if you don't have a president who has those things, watch out. I'm saying that not referring to anyone particular, just making a general point.
It's hard being president. I mean, there's a lot to know about, and there's a lot.
And one of the things is empathy. I mean, you were mentioning Nixon. One thing about Nixon is, and Nixon, did some good things. China, our lives would be different without the opening to China. Nixon's argument was, I deserve to be honored despite Watergate because mainly China, Vietnam, and détente. I give him China, Vietnam. That settlement could have been gotten in January 1969. He killed 30,000 more Americans unnecessarily. And on the Soviet Union, we could have an argument, not tonight, whether détente was right or not, but China, he certainly deserves. What Nixon did not have was empathy. Nixon said in prosecuting the Vietnam War, this is almost a direct quote, I can't get emotionally involved. I have to look at these men as chess pieces. It has to be mathematical. I can't let my emotions get engaged. I don't think there was a great danger that his emotions would have gotten engaged anyway. LBJ, as angry as I am at him for other reasons, his wife said in her diary, Lady Bird, and she was nice enough to give me the unpublished parts of her diary, so I saw her view of him in unguarded moments. And she writes, I don't think Lyndon should be a war president. I'm with her so far. But she says, I don't think he should be a war president because he is so emotional. Every night that there are American flyers over North Vietnam, he stays up all night waiting for them to come home, and he did, and I think that's an honorable thing, and it connects right back to Abraham Lincoln.
I was going to ask you. You clearly admire him very much.
And for one reason, one of the reasons is that Lincoln, when he was running the Civil War, this is someone who, as we know, and as I write about, terribly subject to depression and had terrible loss in his life, lost his mother at an early age, lost his sister. His father was a monster who, scorned the fact that Lincoln lived a life of the mind and read. He said, why don't you do some real work? Had so little relationship with his father that when his father was on his deathbed, he told a family member, I think for me to visit him would be more painful than pleasure for either of us. But when it comes to the time of the Civil War, he was in hell. And I think as much as it caused him to suffer, it made him a better war president because he knew what was at stake. Two things. Number one, he said to an old friend of his, and I quote this in the book, he says, can you imagine me? I can't even stand to watch a chicken being slaughtered. Can you imagine what it feels like to be responsible for oceans of blood? All these young Americans getting killed. And the other thing he did was, there was a need for a national cemetery. Where should it be? Went to the president. Lincoln said, you know, Lincoln had a summer house up the hill from the White House, which was called the Old Soldiers' Home in those days. It's now called Lincoln's Cottage. If you're ever in DC, it's been restored. It's really worth visiting. But he used to go up to Lincoln's Cottage with his family every day during the summer and went back again. He said, build the National Cemetery near my summer home. This will be severely painful to me, but I want to see the graves that are being dug as a result of my decisions. I don't want to be separated from my decisions. I want to know the consequences of the decisions that are being made in this war, as hard as it is on me. That's the kind of president you want. You can clap. I would clap for that too.
So I think there's genuine agreement, certainly in this audience. I would expect that Lincoln was among our greatest presidents, if not our greatest president. So,
And coming from Illinois,
Yeah.
could I take 1 minute to tell how I got to know Lincoln?
Please.
That relates to growing up around here. Would everyone agree that it's sort of an unwritten law that maybe mostly honored that kids should be taken to the Lincoln sites in Springfield at an early age? Would everyone agree with that? Okay. So I was taken when I was about 8, and as I remember, we all know the Lincoln House on 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, and much more nicely restored than it was when I was 8. But I went there and I was shown the chair that Lincoln sat in when he read to his children, and I wish I could report to you that I asked the guide, you know, what were Lincoln's views on civil liberties or something like that. But I was 8, so I said, you know, what did Lincoln do to his children when they behaved badly? Did he spank them? And as I remember, the guide said with this disgusted look, no, can you believe Lincoln didn't believe in discipline? He let those brats run wild through this house. And I heard that. Lincoln was my man. I began literally through reading about Lincoln, and it was the time of the Civil War centennial. This is a long time ago. And reading about other presidents, so it had a lot to do with, but this all fits with the child's view of Lincoln, which is taught better in Illinois still, I would say, than at any other time. And one other thing, if I might interject. Did you all know that the Battle of New Orleans was celebrated for a very long time in the 19th century as a holiday here in Illinois? You'd get the day off, because that was responsible for the Mississippi River being free to river traffic, which was essential to our commerce here in Illinois.
interesting.
Anyway, a little off topic,
That's
but
okay.
since we started on trivia, that was your fault.
No. Trivia is good.
Okay.
So if Lincoln was a great president, a great war president, what's the difference between a great war president and a great president? Or are they the same?
Sometimes wars allow us to see presidential greatness in a way that we otherwise would not. And there's a real problem with that, and you see where I'm going. There's a great problem if a president thinks the only way I'm going to show my stuff is I've got a war. And presidents have said that. Donald Trump has said it, but also Theodore Roosevelt said it. He said he regretted that he did not have a great crisis, and by crisis he meant war, that would have allowed him to show his full leadership capacity. So the problem is that in modern times, we've got a system that doesn't shackle a president from going to war, as we were saying at the beginning. And a president now can take us into a full war almost overnight, almost single-handedly. And I'm not talking about responding to the Soviet missiles flying over the North Pole within 15 minutes. And I'm not talking about, God forbid, responding to a terrorist attack or something like that. I'm talking about a president wanting a large war and knowing that he can do it without getting a war declaration out of Congress. And a resolution, from my point of view, doesn't do it. A resolution you can get pretty cheaply because, as we saw with Desert Storm, we saw with Afghanistan and Iraq, if the war becomes unpopular, a lot of these members of Congress can weasel out of it and say, well, I only voted for a little resolution that authorized armed force. I never voted for a war. If you vote for a war declaration, you can't weasel out of it. And that's why, from my point of view, we should enforce the Constitution. And if a president wants a war, he or she should go to Congress, and there should be a long debate. How long is it going to take? How many Americans are going to be killed? What's your strategy? The best war presidents have been those who had huge criticism from Congress. The worst war presidents have been those who had lapdog members of Congress who thought that they were being patriotic by letting the president do whatever he wants.
So when George W. Bush became president, I thought he could have been a tremendous domestic policy president on racial issues, on education
Gave great promise of that.
And then 9/11 happened, and he took us into 2 wars.
And by the way, what did 9/11 do to his poll ratings?
In the short term, they rose.
90%.
Yeah.
What did the Gulf War to George H.W. Bush's poll ratings?
I assume it rose.
So if you're an unscrupulous president, what is the lesson?
In the short term, it can help, but in the long term.
Okay, but if you're faced with an election in a couple of weeks.
We worry about that with every country. We worry about that with the Chinese.
And I'm not, believe me, I'm not saying this about President Trump. All I'm saying is that we who do not want unnecessary wars because they can be ruinous, we should not hold out these little bonbons for presidents who may be tempted.
And would George W. Bush have been better off in the long run if Congress had asked more questions and had
Totally, and he says so today.
Yeah.
He will say that I would have been a better president if Congress had pushed me harder. I mean, he's enough of a patriot. He knows the way the system operates. I'm not sure that Lyndon Johnson would have longed to have Fulbright and Mansfield be tougher on him, or the same thing true with Nixon, but George W. Bush definitely.
Yeah. So we have 10 minutes. If Donald Trump was standing here right now, we know what you would say to the U.S. Congress if the U.S. Congress was standing here right now. What would you say to Donald Trump if Donald Trump was standing here right now?
I'd say it's an atrocity that you will not read a word of history. And the reason for that is not because I'm just in this profession, but it's the only user's guide a president has, folks. I mean, just think about this. Harry Truman, and I write about this, Harry Truman had no college education, which is a scandal. And he didn't have a college education because this is this brilliant young man, very curious, longing to go to college. His family said, we're too poor, we can't afford it. You've got to go work the plow on our family farm and support the family. And so the result is that Truman doesn't get to college. One lovely story is the second after he becomes president, he says to his aides, I'd like to do something that is distinctively me, not just carry out FDR's aims. And you know what he did? He said, why don't I try to build up the community college system so that other young kids will not have the problems that I did? But despite the fact that he never went to college, he was pretty close to being the most well-read president of presidential history. He loved it, but what was more, he knew that that was an important tool for him as president. He said, every leader must be a reader. And that goes for presidents too. And the book he loved most of all had this horribly politically incorrect title. It was called, I apologize for this, but it's not my book. It was called Great Men and Famous Women. The presumption that women had no chance to be great, only famous. And the subtitle was From Nebuchadnezzar to Sarah Bernhardt. So as you can see, this book covered up a wide swath of human experience. And I don't think Truman, when he was, firing MacArthur or deciding whether to drop the bomb, was thinking of Nebuchadnezzar or Sarah Bernhardt, but he did think of Lincoln, whom he loved, despite the fact that he grew up in a Confederate area, and his mother was so Confederate that she said that if she was forced to sleep in Lincoln's bed in the White House, she would not come to the White House. And also Andrew Jackson. And he said, I never found a situation as president that was directly comparable to what Jackson faced or what Lincoln faced, but I found there were enough facets of what they were dealing with that were similar to what I had to do, that it helped me make these really tough decisions when I was tired, and I had to make about 10 decisions at once, and I never had enough information. He said, I cannot understand how any president could be president without knowing history. Harry Truman was a great man. I say the same thing.
So the most historically literate president, The most historically literate president we had was probably Woodrow Wilson, right?
No, I don't think so.
You don't agree? Okay.
I'm not a Wilson fan.
I picked that up in the book, but he
yeah.
read a history. He had written a history of the United States.
Some people can write great histories and learn Zippo.
Okay, so clearly by the end of the war.
Could I explain that?
Yes,
just
please.
So it's
I mean,
mystifying.
I'm not a fan of.
All right.
I'm not a fan of Woodrow Wilson's. But I'm curious as to what you have to say.
Number one, I think we're even more sensitive than most Americans were before, but we should be. Wilson's views on race are disqualifying.
He was just horrific.
And this is not someone whose views were of his time. He was fringe, extreme, racist, even for his time.
Yes.
Theodore Roosevelt had advanced views on race. Warren Harding, Wilson's successor, had surprisingly advanced views on race. Woodrow Wilson was a racist. He threw African Americans out of the federal government. He showed the racist paean to the Ku Klux Klan, Birth of a Nation, in the White House in an evening of celebration. This was not a good person. Above and beyond that, as a war president, you would think that someone who had justifiably studied as much history as Wilson did would have known that, and Wilson, you're not getting a lot of things, as I'm saying. You're not getting human kindness, you're not getting advanced views on race. You're getting some good progressive reforms in the first term. But the one thing, at least, I would ask of Woodrow Wilson, since he's denying us so many other qualities of presidential leadership, is explaining to Americans why we are involved in World War I, and also truth. Let me begin with truth. What was Woodrow Wilson's slogan in 1916? Since we're on this trivia question, anyone want to oblige? What was the slogan? Total lie. He had been involved in war with the Mexicans, so it wasn't even true then. And he pushed the slogan knowing that he was very likely to be involved in war in a couple of months. So you think of Woodrow Wilson as this pious, truthful, upstanding. He was also a liar, which is a terrible thing in a president. Above and beyond that, his victory in 1916, which was hairbreadth, he almost lost. Guess who gave it to him? His victory came from the analysis of the election returns in 1916 from women. Now you might think, were not women not allowed to vote in 1916? The right to vote was not guaranteed, but some states gave women the vote. And if you look at the primitive analysis of the election returns in 1916, women were the margin for Wilson in state after state that made him president for another term. Why were women for Wilson? Guess what? They were peace-loving. They were gulled by this slogan, he kept us out of war. So he wins another term on false pretenses. So that's the truth part. The other part, in terms of Wilson as public educator, this is something, and I should mention that, I am so woven into the history of the Chicago Council. The first time I ever went to the Soviet Union was in 1975 when I was 19. Guess how? On a Chicago Council trip. That was, how many years ago? 43?
That's great. I'm glad
I'll clap because it was a great trip. But so that's how much you've had to do with my education. So if you disagree, you're to blame. Because that's where this all came from.
Before we go to questions,
I'm joking. Can I just say one other thing?
Okay.
All right. What you want from Wilson is someone who, he's asking us to get involved in a pretty distant war. It's pretty, it's a pretty hard argument to make that this is immediately necessary to get involved in this European war that's gone on for 3 years as a matter of our immediate national security. So wouldn't it be nice to have a president who explains to Americans why he thinks it's a good idea and does so to Congress? He did so in his speech to Congress, but the first year of the war, when Americans were still very puzzled about what we were doing, Wilson basically holed up in the White House and said almost nothing. So then we get to November of 1918. We're a few weeks away from the World War I centennial. Everyone knows what mission creep is, a modern term. This is the biggest case of mission creep I've ever seen in human history. I'm slightly exaggerating for effect. But Wilson suddenly, this is not a war fought for the rather modest reasons he gave to Congress. Suddenly, it's a war to end all wars. It's a war to make the world safe for democracy, to culminate in an international organization, the League of Nations for Peace, all of which he has done virtually nothing to prepare Americans for or explain to them. So just to finish, you have a president who was elected by a hairbreadth under false pretenses, never was elected by a majority, was deeply disliked by those who did not vote for him, never bothered to talk to Americans about why we were doing this war. Then suddenly at the end of the war ends, surprise. This is now for war aims much more grandiose than had ever been revealed. And then, I'm sorry to be so mean to Wilson, but sometimes a president deserves it. If he really wanted the League of Nations, he should have stayed here and argued with Congress and made sure that they were on board. Instead, with his messianic sense of himself, he was sort of the original version of I alone can fix it.
Right.
He went to Europe, spent months negotiating personally at the peace table in Paris, and therefore, because the president was absent from this country without modern communications, the debate over the League of Nations was left mainly to Henry Cabot Lodge and other enemies of the League, and as a result, the Senate forbids us from entering, thereby leading to a large extent to the rise of Hitler and to the advent of World War II. That's what it meant that Woodrow Wilson, from my point of view, was an atrocious war president. Sorry, any Wilson fans in the audience.
And I think there are parallels to non-war issues. You can even think of TPP, which was being negotiated so strongly behind the scenes during the Obama administration, but there was not a lot of public
As a
education
historian,
there.
it's too recent for me.
I agree. As a
I
person
don't know
as a
anything that
person who
happened
was
after
living it.
1968, right?
Yes. Anyway, okay, so I don't get to ask my Grant versus Jackson question. Maybe it'll come up from the audience.
Okay. Is this one of
So
me or?
when we were coming up,
Okay.
right, Grant was mediocre and
I was
Jackson
just learning from our president about Grant the other night.
No, thank you. Well, this is what made me think of it again. And Grant was Grant was
and Lee,
mediocre,
more to the point.
and he has a picture of Jackson up in the Oval Office, right? Yeah. Now we know that Jackson was a war criminal, at least prior to becoming president, and we have a much different view of him.
His
I think
treatment
some people
of
do.
Native Americans.
Treatment of Native Americans, and Grant's morality is kind of has him on the upswing. Is that how do you react to these changes? With
Grant was not without flaws, obviously, but he is much more appreciated than, I think, by historians and to Americans who were interested in this than he was even a decade or two ago.
Yeah. Okay. So
Although Lincoln had this terrible phobia about him, I'm told.
Really?
That's what the president said the other night.
there's a reason I don't watch the news.
Yeah.
Okay.
You'll lead a happier life.
Thank you.
So we're going to take questions, and I think there are a lot of questions tonight. So if you could keep them concise and make sure that your sentence has a question mark at the end of it. So let's see. There is a gentleman way in the back with his hand up. And then we'll come up to you, sir.
This is a Woodrow Wilson descendant who wants equal time. The Wilson Anti-Defamation League.
Well, we started with Article 1 and Congress having the sole power to declare war. And we're only talking about presidents when, and I'm only 1/3 through your book, so you may be answering.
Thank you for reading it.
But when did Congress completely abdicate? Because the imperial presidency, I think, started with FDR, but he was still going and getting declarations of war. And isn't that a necessary fix as much as
Yeah, it's really Congress. I mean, presidents can do bad things, but Congress doesn't have to let them do it. And that's what happened. And what happened, the turning point was really 1950. Harry Truman, whom I also love, mostly. The North Koreans invade the South in June of 1950. And Truman feels that we have to go to war to stop this. And so far, so good. I think he made the right decision. But his advisors are telling him, well, you know, this is a real war, Mr. President. You should go to Congress for a war declaration. And guess what Truman says? And this are in documents of private conversations he had that I used to sort of write these scenes. He says, I can't do that. We're 5 months away from midterms. And he was worried that if there was a big debate on Capitol Hill, it was a time of Joseph McCarthy, it might get rancorous, he might look bad. So instead, he just said, well, I'll just do, I'm not going to listen. In fact, I have it as a chapter title. I don't have to listen to Congress. I'm going to do it on my own. So he sent the troops. Congress did not challenge this. From my point of view, they could have even said it was a violation of the Congress. He later on called it a police action under the United Nations. But that is a little bit kind to Truman. He never called it that. As I show in the book, what happened was there was a press conference and Truman was asked, well, you haven't asked for authorization, and what do you think this is, just some police action under the United Nations? Truman said, yes, that's it. It's just a phrase he got from a reporter, and that was fine, but okay, that's basically the way he thought of it. And all that was bad enough, but guess who was waiting in the wings of Congress, watching the way that Harry Truman was running this war with bated breath? Lyndon Johnson, a new senator. And he was watching Harry Truman, the president, to see the way it's supposed to be done. So you get to 1964, Gulf of Tonkin. Some of Johnson's people say, if you want a war, Mr. President, you should ask for a war declaration. And Johnson says, number one, I've got an election 3 months from now against Goldwater. I don't want to get into a drawn-out debate. And then he says, well, I don't have to ask for a war declaration. Truman didn't either. Bad examples lead to bad behavior later on. Franklin Roosevelt during World War II interned the Japanese, one of the great crimes of history. I feel that Roosevelt did not do enough to thwart the Holocaust, but Roosevelt infringed on civil liberties in other ways, and I don't think it was out of lust for power. I think he did it because there was a war to be won that was crucial. But the problem is that these things have a sneaky habit of recurring later on. When Richard Nixon was looking, anyone remember what the Houston Plan was? Houston Plan was a plan that was, pardon? Tom Charles Houston, a young aide of his. And you want to tell us what the plan was?
We'd have to give him a mic because we're live
Okay,
streaming.
all right,
so
I'll tell. Yeah. It was basically a big violation of civil liberties in wartime because Nixon was running what was by then the War of Indochina. Later on, Nixon was asked, why did you violate civil liberties? And Nixon said, I'm a war president. Roosevelt was a war president. I'm not doing anything that's worse than he did. So whenever a president begins to violate our civil liberties, and presidents can declare martial law, they might someday, they might violate our civil liberties in all sorts of ways. Anyone get the presidential alert announcement on your iPhone?
Yes.
Well, today that may be used for civil defense. One day it may be used by a leader who has aims that are not that benign. Always watch out. We Americans, our liberties are always in jeopardy.
Thank you. Sir, I think I promised to call on you next.
Thank you.
Hi.
Following along on that, I'm not sure what happened in the Balkans in the 1990s. I don't know if anybody declared anything at that point.
There was an air powers authorization, which I wrote the first draft of.
That was a setup. No.
It was brilliantly written.
Thank you.
But then, even moving beyond that, now instead of declaring war on another nation state, somebody declares war on terrorism. And next, do we declare war on bad manners? I mean, what do we declare? What do we do from this point forward?
Well, all I'm saying is if there's going to be an extended conflict and it's going to kill young Americans, idealistic, precious young Americans, and if it's going to cost this nation's treasure and maybe its self-respect someday, we Americans deserve at the beginning to have the president tell Congress what he's got in mind. What's the plan? At the beginning, let's see what the worst case scenario is. This has to be talked out. That's what democracy is. And the other thing is that, as you can see, I'm not very high on James Madison as a war president, but I love and bow before Madison as a founder. And the system, no one here needs to be told this, but just to say the obvious, the system only works when there is conflict. And if you have even well-meaning members of Congress muzzling themselves because they think they're doing the presidency or the country a favor. They're not. And we're going through a time right now where leaders of a president's own party in Congress are muzzling themselves on all sorts of issues. And this is getting outside of history, but I don't think it's going to be great for the future of this country if this continues.
Oh my, so the gentleman there with the glasses on top of his head, his hands were up first, and then we'll get.
In listening to your presentation, I have the sense that it's a description of what happened to the democracy. Are you optimistic that Congress's trend of ignoring these things will continue? Or do you think
I'm optimistic that it's in our DNA to know that this is a system that's based on conflict and people doing their jobs. And by people doing their jobs, I mean Congress going after presidents who do bad things, especially in wartime, about a Supreme Court that has enough diversity on it to overrule a president if he does terrible things. One of the greatest moments, and I'm not saying this, I'm a registered independent. I'm talking about presidential power. I'm worried about presidents who get too powerful. It's a danger to our republic that I think our founders were a little bit too sanguine on, and we have to always watch. One of the greatest moments in American history, from my point of view, was the summer of 1974. A case came up to the Supreme Court involving Richard Nixon's tapes, and by cynical modern people as they see the Supreme Court nowadays, which I think is wrong if you look at a lot of Supreme Court rulings, you would have expected that to be an overwhelming Nixon decision because Nixon had appointed so many members of the Supreme Court. I think 4 of them, if I remember correctly. And they were the ones who were going to rule on the tape. So if you're a cynic, the Nixon appointees are going to rule with Nixon, and there's a very good chance that Nixon is going to win. People thought that at the time. And what happens instead? William Rehnquist, who was a Nixon appointee, recused himself because he had been part of the Nixon Justice Department. The other Nixon appointees were part of a unanimous 8-0 decision that Nixon has to give up his tapes. I don't think it's too much to say that our democracy was saved that summer, and it was saved because the Supreme Court was doing its job. I hope the Supreme Court and the Congress will continue to do their job in the future of making sure that presidential power is leashed. And I think if you look at American history so far, we can be optimistic, but it's only going to happen if we voters demand it.
Well said, thank you. This gentleman right here.
Welcome back home, Michael.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. My question reverts to the 50th anniversary of 2 things, but one of them was the Anna Chennault affair.
Right.
This month,
Right.
October of 1968.
Right.
The other was the Walt Whitman Rostow thesis, better yet known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, your book doesn't really mention Walt Whitman Rostow too much, except with his cable that he gave to Lyndon Johnson on
You wanted the 750-page book to be longer?
No, but I think
my publisher would have thrown me through a window.
I read about Walt Whitman Rostow, and maybe you can elaborate on this. It's a complicated question, but he followed an economist when he was younger named Nikolai Kondratiev, who followed a 50-year cycle of business cycles. Remind you, that's 1968. What did the Agency for International Development and the National Security Council see in Indochina in 1968 that's prevalent now?
In what? I try to stick to only things I know, and that's going to get me. It's going to get me kicked out of Washington one day because not everyone feels that they should abide by the same law, but that's one of mine. So I can't really add to that, but it's an interesting thesis. Can we talk about Anna Chennault, which I do know about? Sure. Okay, back on safe ground. I actually tell the story about that. How many here know who Anna Chennault was? Okay, so I'll take a minute to tell.
Please.
Anna Chennault was the widow of the General Claire Chennault. She was one of the leaders of the China lobby, meaning the Chiang Kai-shek pro-Taiwan lobby. And in the fall of 1968, she was a cutout with Richard Nixon, who used her to send messages to the South Vietnamese government to not play ball with Lyndon Johnson because they'd get a better deal if Nixon came to power. So, Halloween 1968, we're just about to the 50th anniversary, you're absolutely right. Lyndon Johnson went on TV announcing that he would halt the bombing of North Vietnam if there could be peace talks in Paris. So he announced the bombing halt, and because of Anna Chennault's dealings with the South Vietnamese said, we won't come to the peace talks. And the way that affected politics was, the moment that Johnson announced the bombing halt, polls show that voters came flooding to Hubert Humphrey in a very close election, and he was probably likely to win. About 2 days later, the South Vietnamese saying, we're not coming to Paris, and the voters came flooding back to Richard Nixon because the peace talks had collapsed. And there are these great secret tapes that I quote from in this book where Johnson is talking to one of the great senators in American history from our beloved state of Illinois, Everett Dirksen, everyone remember, who was Johnson's great friend. He was minority leader. And Johnson says, you know, I've got FBI listening in on Anna Chennault and all these people, so he knew exactly what was going on. This is treason, he says, in my poor Johnson impersonation. And I have an even worse Dirksen impersonation, so I won't do that. But Dirksen basically says, I don't disagree. And so it sets up an interesting problem because Nixon wins. And another scoop I have in the book is that Johnson actually went to Hubert Humphrey and gave him the goods on what Nixon was doing treasonously against his country, but says, you know, Hubert, this is your election, you decide whether to reveal it or not. And Humphrey said, well, I think it might be too tough to say something that nasty about Nixon, even if it's true. And Johnson's reaction was, that's exactly why that boy should never be president. It was much too soft. And I think he was probably right in this instance, by the way.
Was it a violation of the Logan Act?
Logan Act, as you know, has never been seriously used, so it probably was, but an act is not an act unless it's really prosecuted. Morally, it was treason from my point of view. And just one little epilogue on this. Johnson and Nixon had so much on each other that they could hardly breathe. Mm-hmm. And Nixon was terrified that Johnson would reveal his treason, which would have crippled him as president from the beginning. Johnson was terrified that Nixon would reveal that he had illicitly and illegally exploited the FBI to listen in on conversations of the Nixon circle. So it's like they both got knives at each other's belly. And as I write in the book, and a lot of this had not been known before, you bring up the time clock to the beginning of 1973. All right, another trivia question. What impending problem was Richard Nixon dealing with politically at the beginning of 73? Begins with a W. Watergate. So Nixon gets the bright idea from his young counsel, whose name was John Dean, who, by the way, grew up in Flossmoor just like me. We've talked about it. He's a little older than I am, so it was not when I was living there. But Dean said, they were still friendly at that point, says to Nixon, Mr. President, why don't you blackmail Johnson and say, you know, we're going to reveal your illicit use of the FBI in '68 unless you go to Democratic senators and get them to shut down the Watergate investigation. And then Johnson died, so that could not be used. But what Nixon would have thought is, I reveal Johnson and the FBI, it's going to reveal my treason. It's going to be much, you know, it's like firing a gun and the gun explodes in your own face. So none of that happened, but, you know, the lives of our saints, what can you do?
Well, I guess I need to end on something happy. I guess the good news is we survived all this period, right?
Well,
we survived Watergate.
The good news, we did, and the good news is we have noble presidents like Abraham Lincoln, our fellow Illinoisan, above all. And the lesson of Lincoln, I think, is the lesson for any war president, and that is that Lincoln's first year, he had problems with the generals. He had a year and a half of formal education, and a lot of that was blab school with kids of all ages, so he was self-taught. and he was a brilliant reader and thinker, so thank God he could read books of military history and strategy, come up to speed pretty soon. But what made him an effective and a great war president was that the problem was that for the first year or two, he was basically saying, he's trying to sort of split the difference as a lawyer might, and someone who liked to conciliate. He was saying essentially, this is a war it's not about slavery, it's about fulfilling the constitutional obligation of southern states not to secede, it's illegal. I'm just sort of, it was like Eisenhower at Little Rock. I've not got any dog in the fight of civil rights, I'm just, fulfilling a Supreme Court order by sending the 101st Airborne now down to Little Rock to integrate the schools. Now, Eisenhower, in his heart, knew that integration was the right thing to do, and so did Lincoln even more so. Not integration, but that slavery was right to end. So beginning in 1862, he says, this war isn't working, and maybe one reason is, this is me talking, not Lincoln, but this is basically his thinking. I'm trying to pretend this is a war about some legalistic, obligation not to secede, and this is a war about slavery, and why don't I start talking about the moral content of that war? And the second he does that, that just lights a fire that makes Americans of the North fight harder and to understand what is at stake in the Civil War. When you have a president who understands that and can articulate it, anything is possible from us Americans. That's what Wilson did not do well in World War I. People did not understand what we were fighting for. World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, a much greater man and greater president, knew that that was essential. And in fact, when Roosevelt was struggling with the early months of whether to get involved in World War II or not, guess what he was reading? There's no reason anyone should know this. I mean, it's in the book, but you haven't gotten to the late page in which this appears. So he was reading Carl Sandburg's Lincoln. What better book would you want Roosevelt to be reading in 1940 and 1941? So in case Roosevelt had any desire not to do this, he knew that he'd better start talking fast about moral purpose. So he's giving a State of the Union. January of 1941, American entry in World War I or World War II is in the balance. And what's the speech he gives? The four freedoms. We are in a struggle for the four freedoms around the world. This is what is morally at stake in this war. When our soldiers went off to fight and possibly die, they weren't fighting for some balance of power. They were fighting for moral purpose. And that's America at its best. It has been in the past. It can be yet again.
And on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you to Cécile, if I might say. Cécile's been a wonderful moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We have books for sale, and I believe Michael's going to stick around for a little while and sign as many as he can for those of you who have time. So please, I encourage all of you to pick up a copy because it's wonderful.
Thank you again.